2024 marks our 30th anniversary. It was back in 1994 that several patient advocates from Europe and Israel sat in the back of the room at the European Working Group on Gaucher's disease in Trieste, Italy, and listened to lectures by researchers, scientists, and also pharma companies on Gaucher's disease. It became very clear after this meeting that there was a need for all the patients to work together, to come together, to be collaborative, and to be one voice. In 2018, it became the International Gaucher Alliance, and then also a registered charity. Today we have 59 member countries, and we work in another 20 where we know that there is much needed work to be done. We believe we represent 90% of the global Gaucher community. It has been my absolute pleasure, and continues to be my absolute pleasure, to be the CEO of the International Gaucher Alliance. I started off as a volunteer in 1999 and then became the executive director. And since 2008, I have been the CEO. Understanding where we have come from and what we have achieved over the last 30 years is really important. This clearly can demonstrate to other patient groups what can be achieved through collaboration. I'm now going to hand over to 3 people who represent different stakeholders who have contributed significantly in our journey over the last 30 years to achieve better patient outcomes.
Thank you, Tanya. Welcome to the 30th anniversary Fireside Chat of the International Gaucher Alliance. I'm Jeremy Manuel. I was one of the founders of the European Gaucher Alliance as it was initially, became the International Gaucher Alliance, and am now its Honorary President. With me is Professor Hans Aerts, a Professor of Medical Biochemistry, who was the founder of the International Working Group on Gaucher disease, and who I first met in 1994. Also with us is Dr. David Meeker, who I first met in the mid-1990s. Dr. Meeker is President and Chief Executive of Rhythm Pharmaceuticals, but we know each other from the long time he spent working with Genzyme, becoming Sanofi Genzyme, starting initially in Paris, and then resulting in him becoming Chief Executive of Sanofi Genzyme. We clearly had close relationships and interactions with Genzyme over the years. So today our plan is to have a chat, to have a fireside chat about our reminiscences about the European Gaucher Alliance, International Gaucher Alliance now, for the last 30 years. We founded in 1994, and we founded originally following the meeting of the International Working Group on Gaucher disease. And firstly, I'd like to ask Professor Aerts to say a few words about himself and the thinking about involving the patient groups with the International Working Group then, and some of the early lessons.
Well, I am a trained biochemist, and fortunately, already during my PhD, I was sent by my mentor, Professor Joseph Steger in Amsterdam, to NIH, and there I spent some time at the laboratory of Roscoe Brady and John Berenger, isolating enzyme from placentas, which was, of course, the first academic stage that evolved into the enzyme replacement therapy as we know it today. So my PhD topic was Gaucher disease, biochemical investigations. So that started in end 1983, and since then I'm hooked to this fascinating disorder. So it became clear when ERT became available that the interest in Gaucher disease was growing exponentially, and that there would be a place for a meeting, for a platform in Europe where clinicians and laboratory researchers together with patient associations could meet. So when we decided to set up the European Working Group on Gaucher disease, that recently has become officially the International Working Group, it was clear from the start that we would involve patients.
What was the driver, though, to involve patients? You say it was
Well,
clear from the start.
to be honest, I had been involved with patients and patient society from the start of my work on Gaucher disease, because in the Netherlands there was a very active Gaucher community, as you know.
Yeah.
And we really got a lot of inspiration from that and in our basic research. And as soon as ERT became available, which was very rapidly performed in the Netherlands, one of the first places in continental Europe, of course I also involved the patient society. I was in close contact with them. We had 3 monthly meetings already prior to the ERT. So it was really apparent that with all these new developments, that we had to involve the patient society. And that's also, let's say, the way of thinking and the spirit that I tried to be present in this EWGGD. Yeah.
I mean, it was a very novel approach, and of course, that itself proved the catalyst for the coming together of the European Gaucher Alliance. And I vividly remember being there, and you kindly asking me to say some words at the end. But actually, we would shuffle in at the back of a scientific meeting. We'd see slides and presentations that as non-scientists, doctors, we didn't understand. And I remember vividly, there was a debate about whether it was appropriate for clinicians and scientists to talk about all these things, the health risks, in front of the patients. And the overriding message that we came away with, it wasn't that it was could somehow be upsetting, it was inspirational, because here was a disease that not many people knew things about, and here were the Europe's experts literally sort of scratching their heads, sharing information to try and help the patients, and that was an inspiration. Yep. David, what was your first engagement with the patient groups?
Thanks, Jeremy. So just quick background. As you said, I'm a physician by training, pulmonary critical care. And I joined Genzyme in 1994, so right at the start of this journey. And Hans mentioned his early interaction with Roscoe Brady at the NIH, and Genzyme came out of that. And Henry Tamir, the original CEO, founding CEO for Genzyme, there's famous stories about that. As Hans said, that the isolation of enzyme from placenta was a heroic task, and trying to figure out, does it work? It turned out, of course, it's simple in hindsight, but in the beginning it wasn't obvious it worked, and it was much a matter of dose and how do you do that. And the famous story for Henry was, everybody told him, don't try it. It's too risky, not going to work. And how did he pick the dose? And the short answer was he gave all the enzyme he could to 12 patients. And that was, the history of Genzyme, how it started. So I joined that company, but I joined to work on the cystic fibrosis gene therapy program that Genzyme was running in parallel. And I have to say that the two experiences of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is another rare disease community, but it was much better organized at that time. Diagnosis was much better, centers of excellence were emerging, and that patient foundation had a major role in driving the agenda. So then I'm exposed to the Gaucher Foundation, and in a very similar way, but at a much earlier point in time, the power of having patients in the room with their understanding. And I really came to appreciate that, when you know so little about a disease, both clinically, the natural history of the disease, obviously scientifically, the biology behind the disease, if you don't have the complete picture, meaning all stakeholders, scientists, if there's industry, pharmaceutical companies are working on it, they need to be in the room, and most importantly, the patient themselves, because that's where it starts and that's where the clues came from.
But didn't that come with a bit of a price, that the patients were hungry for access to treatment, often in territories where it wasn't available. And you had what was becoming an increasingly vociferous patient body that were putting pressure on you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeremy, and we'll, I'm sure, dive into our history together and a little bit more. But I would go back one step earlier, which is this drug could not have been developed without close cooperation with the patients and the patient organizations. I mean, if you're developing a drug for hypertension, you don't have a problem going out and finding some patients with hypertension and involving them in trials, and much has been known. But in this disease, we knew so little, and so there was a partnership that was formed very early. Now, embedded in that partnership was some inherent tension, and part of that tension was a very small company trying to figure out how it was going to survive and be sustainable with a treatment that turned out to be quite expensive to make and was very, very expensive for the patient community at the price point it was priced at. And so the general philosophy that Henry adopted, and which became very clear to me from the beginning, yes, it's expensive, but our obligation as a company is to do everything we can to make sure that those who need it can get it. Now, obviously, as a small company, the demand was much greater than what we could do. Second is, if you give the drug free everywhere, of course, the company goes away and then nobody's helped. And so, Jeremy, you and I had many, many strong, good discussions about, how do you walk that line, and how can we, literally, the two of us, and the scientific community was right there hand in hand, find a way to increasingly make this accessible in the healthcare systems that could afford it. That was easier. In the healthcare systems where they were emerging and they had many challenges beyond simply rare disease, not so easy. And so I think that was the strength, and for me, one of the most rewarding parts of my engagement with this, the whole community.
Thank you for that. I will come back to that because I'd like to talk a little bit about the humanitarian aid program, the driver from Henry Samir to do that, and some of the discussions that we had over the years. But coming back to the scientific meetings, the EWGGD as it was, what memories do you have about the patient involvement in the meetings and the impact that had to the shape of the meetings, to the discussions that we've had? The EWGGD was very generous about giving patients a voice in their main meeting.
Yeah. To answer your specific question, the input of the patient or the patient societies, and as we already discussed, it was the policy from the start of the working group to have to invite a representative, at least, of each existing European patient association. And we really felt that their feedback of what was developing in the field was of extreme importance. So where appropriate, that was also discussed. And you also have to keep in mind that many of the things that basic scientists tend to study, the questions are initially raised by the patients, to be honest. Yeah. They ask you something, and because they ask you something, you start to think about it. And usually you can't answer the question. So that's the start of basic research very often. So at the Trieste meeting, we already had a talk by one patient, as you may recall for those that were there. And that was of interest, a patient that also had Parkinson's disease in 1994. So that's actually a little bit ahead of the general realization or recognition now, that there is this relationship between defects in GBA1 and the risk of Parkinson's disease. And what we also did by purpose in the meetings to have sessions in which lesser experienced clinicians would present a clinical case. So again, because that would give inspiration to basic scientists or more experienced clinicians to also have a look at a certain aspect, let's say a particular symptom.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And the reality is, for the patient community, the presence at the meeting was obviously an inspiration in sitting in the sessions and trying to understand what was going on, but very much the opportunity of networking of patients meeting other patients themselves and sharing their experiences, patients meeting clinicians. Often some patients came from countries where there was very little expertise in Gaucher disease, and be able to collar the well-known clinicians, and also meeting representatives of industry, because they had the opportunity of talking to them and trying to understand the way things work. Very often, patients were either patients themselves or parents of children who were patients, who didn't have an experience of lobbying governments to access treatment, to try and change the healthcare program, to understand how it works or understand the science. And quite often were in countries where there wasn't expertise. What was your experience, and through your representatives, David, at these various meetings? How valuable was it to be at these meetings for the company?
Invaluable. I mean, like I said, I think it would have been impossible to have made the progress we've made as our contribution to it from industry without having been part of those meetings. And, from the scientific standpoint, what was striking in the beginning is, how intimate it was. These were small scientific working groups, as opposed to the big meetings where, your little disease may be a little corner of that, larger meeting. This was dedicated time by individuals who were devoting their time and research, to this specific problem. So you couldn't find a richer scientific forum to be at. And then the patient presence and the patient involvement in that, again, what was, my learning from that was just how incredibly natural it was. I mean, it was so comfortable. I mean, yes, there were highly scientific conversations happening, and for sure there were patients in the room for whom the science was way over their head, but there was no lack of engagement. No matter, even if you couldn't follow every slide, people could take home the conclusions. And I think from a patient standpoint, Jeremy, and you can tell me, to me, probably the biggest gift of those is hope. And again, in rare diseases, you feel alone. You're in the whole diagnostic journey we may get into and the like, which remains a challenge today, amazingly. You go to a meeting like that, and you can't help but come away and feel hope. And then your specific question was in terms of working together and going to governments and trying to figure out, how, with these healthcare systems, can we solve the problem? And we did that together, always. And, invariably, if you asked how, if a new person joined Genzyme, you said, well, how do you get started? What do you do first? And, the first thing is you find an interested physician and you find a committed patient and or family. And that's the nucleus. And it's that nucleus that allows you to go to the healthcare system and advocate for a solution, which isn't just, payment for a treatment. It was really, we need this healthcare system to put in place things that will allow patients with Gaucher disease to have a reasonable chance of being diagnosed and being seen by somebody knowledgeable about the disease.
But the cynic might say, and I had it leveled against me, that the company was, to use the expression, using the patients as a sort of an additional marketing tool. Now, obviously, you and I have talked about this over the years, and we have a very strong confidence in our own independence. But what was your response to that?
Yeah, I think one thing that people may not realize is, Gaucher disease, again, 1991, when the first enzyme was approved, the research started in the late 1980s. No company was interested. Genzyme was the only company working in the space. So because we were alone in this space, I actually didn't feel like we were industry in the way people often think about the pharmaceutical industry today. I mean, I really felt like we were equal partners on this journey and working together. And the marketing question, and I still believe this today, working in rare diseases, which I've done my whole career. In rare diseases, it's not about marketing. This is all about, and rare diseases only work if you solve the problem. Right? If there's an unmet need and you're providing a legitimate solution that meaningfully changes the outcome for that patient, the challenge is getting the patient diagnosed. It's not marketing the drug. And so we just were working to be part of the community to help that happen, because from a self-interest point of view, just in terms of sustainability of the business, if the patient's diagnosed and they need the drug, then fine, this can work if we can get it going. But it didn't start there. In fact, I would argue we didn't need to sell the drug to anybody. I mean, the whole concept was, if we could help this community get stronger and build all the elements that allow rare disease patients with this rare disease in general, get to an earlier diagnosis and a larger community of knowledgeable people. As you mentioned, you have many physicians who were coming to these meetings, and this was their first exposure to Gaucher. They were recruited by, would you be interested? There's a Gaucher patient they need somebody to take care of. Would you be willing to do that? You can go to this European Gaucher meeting or international Gaucher meeting and learn something about it. Those were just elements. So for us, it wasn't, I realized the charge, but I never felt defensive or a need to defend it. It was so clear.
And in those early days, was it an issue for the scientific and the clinical community? Particularly, there was only one company in the...
Well, of course, it was felt that the European Working Group on Gaucher disease should have an independence of industry. But from the start, we made the symposia open to industry. They could send a representative. However, they were not in a position to determine the program. Yeah? So, and I think that that relationship evolved naturally in this way, but it was quite clear that what the role was of, let's say, the industry and the role was of the working group. And when looking back at it, I think this was the right solution for it. Because of its independence, if the working group would advocate something similar as industry would, because it was independent, it say had some power.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And if you allow me, one of the reasons why the working group was successful also was that we were fortunate in the period that it started, because the spirit of the 1990s, early 1990s, was very much in doing things together. There was the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was the Treaty of Maastricht, the people from Eastern European countries could meet with people in the West. So to have a society that combines clinicians, basic researchers, patient associations, and involves also industry was really in the spirit of the time. I think that really contributed to the success as well.
And that brought, of course, our own challenges with you in getting access to former Eastern European countries. And you and I had numbers of conversations over access to treatment in, let's call them former Eastern European countries, to treatment into Romania and Bulgaria and actually Ukraine. We had discussions. And of course, we had a meeting in Moscow about getting treatment into Russia. Do you want to share some experiences of that?
Yeah, it was back to the spirit of what we mentioned earlier, which is we recognized as a company that we had the only treatment for a potentially life-saving therapy. And so the responsibility that came with that was huge. And we also, as I said earlier, recognized that we needed to find a sustainable solution as a small company because it was our only treatment. If we couldn't make this one financially viable, then we would go away, and of course nobody would be helped. So that was the balance, the tension we were working on, and the way we thought about this, and the way I often explained it was, look, we have an obligation to treat everybody we can who needs it to the best of our ability, and so the caveat was our ability, and that's where we worked hard to try to help people understand and figure that out. The way we would often do this, if you remember, Jeremy, it was really important that whatever system we were talking to made some commitment to the disease. In other words, if Genzyme came in and just gave the drug free, that was not going to be sustainable. The system says, thank you, I don't need to learn anything about Gaucher disease. You guys just do what you want. You've got your free drug over there. So we needed that Ministry of Health to do something. And often what they did was, a willingness to support a center of excellence, a willingness to treat children. We'll treat the adults. Just you treat the children. And children, as we all know, when you're approaching a healthcare system and the politics being what they are, it's much easier for a politician to help a child. And so children were at the forefront, I think, also of, helping people understand this need and the disease and the like. And so that's what we were trying to do. And again, it would have been absolutely impossible without going there together. If Genzyme as a company had just walked in the door and said, we want to treat the children, nothing would have happened. If we went there, as we did, with a family, with a physician who was the leading person in it, and then made the case and said, look, let's find a way to do this together. And that's how we got started.
Yeah. But there were challenges at the time.
Many.
and I remember coming back, and I must take this moment actually to remember IGA founders who are no longer with us. And perhaps I'll start with Susan Lewis, and she was the one who was due to address the meeting in Moscow. She wasn't well enough to travel, and I came and gave her presentation and came back to London, and she said, well, what about access to treatment in Moscow? And I said, look, I had a long conversation with David Meeker, there was this challenge, and the government do this, and if you remember, there was an issue about having to pay VAT when you were sending humanitarian aid in, and it was a big thing, and it's going to take a few months. And Susan Lewis said to me rather sternly, and you accepted that, did you? So, there was no giving up to that. And of course there were others that we remember too. There was Ria, of course, who was so instrumental, Ria Hut from the Netherlands, who was very instrumental in the early days, very keen on developing relationships with patient groups around the world. In those days it was mainly Eastern Europe, as we said. And we think about their great contribution to the EGA, as well as Ghislaine Sorel, who worked very closely with Romania, if you'll remember. And, these were the original founders.
You remind me of part of the Russian story. So my first trip to Moscow, and I don't know if it predated that meeting, it might well have been that meeting, but what I really came to understand is our initial contribution in Russia was testing. And we were supporting a lab which was doing it. And amazingly, these two women that came to some of the meetings, and I apologize, I forget their names, but they were doing in this small lab basically all of the testing for Gaucher disease for the country. And they had this list. And that was the start, because without that testing, that identity of the patients who could then, and when we went to the Ministry of Health and had that meeting and were able to present them the case, and I think they had a special fund that we were lobbying, trying to help them think about how it could be used here. Anyway, it started with the testing. That was my point. It's
it's useful, and I think the fact that the European Gaucher Alliance all pitched up in Moscow and had our meeting there, and with industry and with other leaders was important to that. Hans, some recollections of over the years of the impact of the relationship between EWGGD and the EGA as it was. There have been lots of incidents, and we'll come on to humanitarian aid, I think, in a minute as a separate.
Yeah.
But any particular?
Well, for example, in a certain way, the interactions with the IGA influence also the program of the symposia during the years. I remember vividly that at the second symposium already we had the first talk on substrate reduction therapy. But on the third meeting, which was in Lemnos, which has been alluded to in 1997, related to SRT, because that had in potential the promise of being also applicable to the type 3 Gaucher patients. This was a major topic on the agenda at that meeting. And of course, Tanya, Colin Histad, contributed to that. And since then, type 3 Gaucher disease is a regular topic on the agenda, and it needs to be a regular topic on the agenda.
Yeah. I mean, that was a very important moment for the patient community in terms of collaboration, is that you invited us to the meeting, you wanted to hear from us, and Tanya raised the subject of neuronopathic Gaucher disease. It wasn't hugely on the agenda, and said, can we establish a working group to develop? And it did, and the European Working Group established a position paper.
It was even a paper,
Yeah, and then there was a subsequent paper, of course, about the use of SRT.
Yeah.
Says a little bit about that, how that came about.
Well, of course, SRT was a. I mean, let's be honest. We had a very successful ERT for type 1 Gaucher disease, so. There wasn't so much in those days a lot of urge to develop an SRT for type 1 Gaucher disease. It was largely the promise that it gave for going beyond type 1 Gaucher disease, maybe in those days. And but of course we were interested. There were other reasons to apply an oral treatment instead of these infusions. So so that's why this still evolved into a topic of interest of the Gaucher field.
But there was, I mean, David, how was that for you? I mean, you'd had this period of not always an easy relationship, a lot of pressure from the patients about access to treatment, but you had a sort of a period of exclusivity of treatment, and along came SRT, different method of delivery, different treatment being talked about at the IWGDD. I remember a bit of a couple of tetchy sessions in Jerusalem, if I could call it that way, when there were presentations about it. How did that shape or change the relationship that you had, Genzyme had, with both the clinical and scientific community and the patient community? Was that a factor?
Yeah, it's so the short answer is no, and I'll tell you how I've always viewed it, and I think correctly, that as you make, from a pure business standpoint, as the opportunity becomes larger, you attract more interest, and that's of course exactly what everybody in the community, certainly the patients, want. And in a rare disease, the biggest challenge is not getting your drug to a patient. The biggest challenge is getting the patient diagnosed. And so the more energy, the more interest, the more companies, the more whatever, increases the number of patients being diagnosed, so the pie gets bigger. So from a Genzyme standpoint, yes, it changed a little bit because there was now another, I think only one other company at that point that was coming in and interested to do it, and you didn't have that same sort of comfortable and a close partnership where nobody was worrying so much about is this industry trying to do something. I think it highlighted the fact that okay, so industry's in the room, now we need to be a little more careful. So I think that was one dynamic. The second dynamic, which was interesting, and I've come to appreciate this and watched it in some different rare disease communities I've worked with. And the communities tend to get over this, but the worst thing that can happen is that members of the community start taking sides. And that's where it becomes a bit more destructive in terms of how this. And I think there was a little bit of that moment, but we worked it through. And I think, we exited, and I don't think it was even that long, with this general view that, the science drives this, the need drives this. And as it should and does basically in all the worlds I work in, certainly. So it was okay, but I think you highlighted the Jerusalem. That was that first moment where this naive community, and I'm part of that naive community, suddenly was exposed to a new reality, which had some incredible positives, but also some negatives.
And I mean, again, memories in was it 2006? In Prague, the meeting, there was also some sort of fierce discussions or spirited discussions about SRT coming online,
Yeah, but I felt always that differences of opinion there was still respect among my members, even when they had a different opinion. So I don't think the Gaucher community was harmed by it, to be honest. And it would become clear what the position would be of SRT when it would be applied for a while, and then of course that would there was a reality check near the corner, around the corner.
Do you think that because there was this strong pre-existing relationship between certainly the patient community, the clinical community, the scientific community, that it gave them the resilience of being able to take a high-level view of the distinction between the different treatments and the understanding?
Exactly. I think that's, and in a certain way, maybe our community, the EBGG community, contributed to that the ability to have this higher view. Yeah. I think that's one of the merits of that of this society. Yeah.
One of the great strengths.
Yeah, because it's not the same with all rare inherited diseases, I can tell you.
Yeah. So sort of the idea about the unique community.
Yeah.
And that is a sort of good segue into the next topic I'd like to bring up, and perhaps David, I should let you start this, is the shortage, the terrible catastrophe of the virus in your bioreactors, the global shortage. Perhaps if you could start us, and then we can talk about the clinical and the patient response to that.
Yeah. So I think it was 2009. I was very close to this because I was given responsibility for the manufacturing about 3 months before the virus hit. And so I was learning rapidly as we went through that. And it was just a devastating, small companies, rare disease worlds, you don't build a lot of duplicity or duplication back up into your systems necessarily. It doesn't support, the need doesn't support it. You don't need 5 plants to provide, enzyme for a small community. So we were very dependent, completely dependent on this one plant, the famous Alston plant where the virus occurred. So when we did have the viral contamination and that plant went down, we had inventory, but we rapidly worked our way through it. And as you when you introduced the concept or this part of our history, we had a world, and I don't remember the percentages, but back to the humanitarian aid, we did have a very high percentage of patients who were getting free drug. So, from a company standpoint, if you have a shortage, I mean, the easiest thing to do is to say, from a pure financial health standpoint, we have to, cut, the free drug part of this because it just doesn't work. So we didn't do that, and we realized that we've been with this, and it was not a hard decision internally, to be honest with you. I mean, it wasn't like people sat around and wrung their hands. I mean, we've been part of this community from the beginning. Whether somebody was paying for this in Eastern Europe or not paying, or China, or I mean, it was truly. I mean, at that point we were literally pretty much everywhere in the world, and almost every country had a mix of free and paid drug, some almost completely free. So long story short is the decision was made is we cut dose equally, and that's what. So what got really hard is that we did not go into new places. So the ability to add new patients, and particularly in disadvantaged, that I can't remember exactly, but probably almost completely stopped. And we really focused on those patients who are already on treatment, as I said, cut the dose for everybody, and then just worked as hard as we could to get back online. But
and there were further step backs along the way, I seem to remember, when things were going. Then there was this power outage, the power supply. So when you got going again, there was that problem too.
Yeah, I put that in the category of life, but yes, I mean, just some remarkably unbelievable that it could happen now, because that specific incident you highlight was, I won't take you through it, but it was freak beyond freak.
Yeah.
in terms of unusual. And yes, it just compounded the problem. And it's the challenges, and what was really, I'll tell you what was really striking to me, Jeremy, because I met with many patients groups around the world during that time, is people were angry, correctly and understandably, but the resilience was just incredible. And the resilience, again, came from them being part of these communities, and also an understanding, that, Genzyme, maybe you could have prevented this, maybe you could have had another plant, maybe yes, of course, but also an understanding that, okay, now it's happened, let's see what we can do together. And again, back to, the role of, the IGA and others in terms of helping us think about how to navigate that period.
Yeah, and I think it must be said, of course, there was a spirit of openness from you. It wasn't a sort of, dig your head in the sand and hope it'll go away and talk to us when it's over. Even when you had the second catastrophe with the actually, you were on the phone, Henry Samir was on the phone to the patient communities explaining it. Hans, do you remember, I'm sure you do remember, how it was reacted? The patient community were panicked. Absolutely, what do we do? How do we prioritise? And we came to the EWGGD and say, well, let's work on this.
So I only can say something about the Dutch situation.
Yeah.
And maybe it has to do with the character of our countrymen and females. But it wasn't too bad, actually. People accepted the reality, and that we had to deal with this. So some patients were reduced in dose, and it was checked with biomarkers and the clinical assessments whether that was tolerated. So we worked through it. So I don't recall it as a major...
But there was the meeting in Bad Honnef.
Yes.
That had people sitting round the table.
Of course, there was some emotion.
There was some emotion,
yes.
And there were clinicians from around the globe, really.
Yeah.
And there was the paper that was written that was a collaborative, setting a hierarchy of patients who would get treatment in terms of their clinical need, whether the biomarkers were high, their bone problems were high, there were pregnant women and so on. And it was an important moment that the EWGGE stepped up and led the world in terms of how you address it.
Yeah, exactly. So it was trying to find a solution, just as David also alludes to, a solution to a situation that was a reality at that moment.
Yeah.
And I think, so in my mind, it worked out relatively well altogether.
Yeah.
But there was, of course, some emotion that we were in that situation, but so we had to figure out how to deal with it.
But at the time you were looking at doing your SRT studies, I seem to remember, and there was this issue about availability of drug to do comparators.
Oh, yeah. I was going to mention, I mean, as you said, you highlighted when substrate reduction therapy came as a concept, and, how did Genzyme see that? And of course, at one level there's competition, but it pushed Genzyme to, initiate the scientific program and ultimately, develop its own version of a substrate reduction therapy, which is now commercial. And yes, we were going through, and I don't remember exact dates, apologies, the timing of all those trials, but, it was a alternative to, potential alternative to enzyme replacement therapy. And so I don't, were you asking, because I'm not remembering there was so much created tension, but it was just another element that we, where do you run the trials and how do you do all that? And I mean, there's, when you're doing a new therapy for any disease, ideally you'd like people who haven't been on another treatment. I mean, that's the easiest way to show whether it works or doesn't work. So taking people who had been on enzyme replacement therapy was not the optimal clinical trial design in terms of how to do that, because they've already, in theory, improved by virtue of being on enzyme, and then you add it in. Whereas if you take somebody who's never seen treatment, the opportunity to show if it works or doesn't work is much greater. So I think that was part of what we were trying to work through.
Yeah, okay. You raised the issue about humanitarian aid, and certainly Genzyme, from my perspective, did the honourable thing by not cutting the humanitarian aid. It would be I would think from a moral standpoint, a terrible thing to do, and you didn't. It wasn't, as far as I was aware, considered for a second. Can we just explore the humanitarian aid strategy a little bit? Henry Tamir had always said and made quite clear that Genzyme would do what it could to provide free enzyme in life-threatening situations. And I know experience of that going back to 1995 or 6 when we were trying to get treatment into Calicut in southern India. And there's a sort of a long story of that. And that was adopted. What was the thinking? Where was it? It was a novel strategy because, of course, other companies just have a structure, but you seem to have embraced that.
Yeah, I would say, we looked at the overall humanitarian. It's back to, again, the sustainability of a business. And I'm not going to apologize for going back to the business part of this, because without a business, there is no treatment. And what was great, and Jeremy, you of course got this, instantly, was the community needs a business model that works. So when we're thinking about, because that's where the investment comes and that's what drives it, and all the quote unquote good comes and sustainability comes from that business model. So as we thought about humanitarian aid, I would layer it a bit and say healthcare systems that could pay, of course we worked with them, and that was pretty conventional and traditional. Emerging healthcare systems where we believed that in some reasonable period of time, that healthcare system was going to strengthen, and there would be an opportunity to move it to a more sustainable, not purely humanitarian effort. That's the one where we're really looking and demanding that partnership. Basically saying, look, we needed some commitment on your part. We can do our side. We'll work together. We were in there for the long haul. It wasn't like, we're going to do it for a year and then next year it's up to you. It's recognition that, no, decade, right? I mean, and many places. China, we were in there very early. Free drug with zero reimbursement for well over a decade in China. Still remains challenging today. India, which you highlighted, Pakistan, there were many patients being diagnosed in Pakistan who needed treatment. And these were areas where we recognized, I'll come back to India in a minute, but the prospect of near-term healthcare system ability to pay was low. And so there, when you go in, and you also know when you go in and you treat a patient, it's not like you can give them 2 years and stop. This is a chronic replacement therapy, so you're going in and you're committing to that patient for their lifespan, as long as Genzyme, quote unquote, has an ability to do that. So those were why it was much more measured in some of these early, and then back to your point, so you needed criteria because the numbers were so much greater than what we could possibly do, and so then it was really a life-threatening situation. And Gaucher in general is life-threatening, but it's imminently life-threatening.
There's an impact on this in terms of cost of drug, and I remember presenting at a meeting of payers actually in the UK, and we were talking about this company and they were doing marvellous stuff, and we were talking about rare disease policy and so on, and they said it's all very well, but why should we be paying if they're giving free drug in a different part of the world?
Yeah, it was of course always a sensitive discussion, also for example in the Dutch community.
Yeah.
But in general, I think people were happy the way it was done. They felt that also people that share the same disease, should have some access, and that the program took care of that. So it never. Maybe an occasional patient would take a different stand, but it was never the general view that something was not good with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it set the standard. Enzyme replacement therapy that you developed has set it is the gold standard treatment, remains the gold standard treatment, and presumably will be until gene therapy comes along and works. Any comments, backward view on the costing issue? It was the challenge. In the early days, the argument was always this is you know, a rare disease, there are a small number of people, we've got to recoup the R&D, but as it turns out, there are far more patients worldwide than anybody ever imagined, and therefore the market is bigger. I understand some of them are challenging. But any sort of reflections with hindsight?
Yeah, no, you know, I mean, this was again part of our many conversation. Yeah.
Yep.
I often highlight, you know, in the United States and then subsequently, I guess, in Europe, but you know, people reference the orphan disease legislation as a really critical policy that drove innovation in rare diseases. And so that was good legislation, good in Europe, which was modeled, I think, on the US one. But I will argue that played a relatively minor role. And the thing that drove rare disease innovation in ultra rare, where I'm not talking about the bigger quote unquote rare diseases, but diseases like Gaucher, where you start out, you know, literally, as you know, Jeremy, we thought, you know, a few 100,000 patients maybe known or whatever. Now there's, you know, maybe 10,000 globally, but still that's a small global number. When Henry Tamir set the price where he set it, that was what drove innovation. Because suddenly everybody looked at it and said, oh my God, you can make a business out of these very rare populations. And it was because of that they came in. The competition, the small molecule exists because the drug was priced where it is. Gene therapy will come because the drug was priced where it was priced. So it's one of those things where it's on an individual patient level, it's almost inconceivable, right? I mean, that a treatment could cost that much and the like. In a bigger societal piece, it was the right thing. Now, that's where I sit. But I've had a lot of time to reflect on this. I've seen many different diseases, and I can tell you that what I don't approve of is the concept where the concept gets abused, and it gets abused in the setting of, you know, I've got an orphan disease, therefore I can charge an orphan price. No. It's a function of rarity. And so then you get back to, okay, how rare? That, you know, that's a healthy discussion. Yeah. But the point is it's a function of rarity. So.
Okay. No, thank you for that. Hans, have you got any comment?
No, I fully agree with this.
Yeah. I mean, it's always a topic, you know. Genzyme was the most expensive drug of its time. Obviously been overtaken since then, and that was obviously a topic of conversation and obviously much debate. Particular memories, standout incidents of the relationship with the International Gaucher Alliance, European Gaucher Alliance, and now International Gaucher Alliance. Any particular one or two that you can think of? Hans, you go first.
To be honest, for me, the relationship with the patients always has been inspirational. That's why I got hooked in studying this disease. And I always have appreciated most, for example, awards that I received from the patient societies. And it's still like that. And so it's really, you're very fortunate as a scientist if you can work on a topic and you can see that it really makes a difference to people's life. Not your contribution alone, but that you're part of a large group of people during an extended period of time that really finds, for example, a therapy or finds better diagnostic tools, or it's really very, very rewarding. So, and that, in that sense, yeah, it's an essential element for me. I can't imagine doing the work without interactions with.
So it's less of an individual incident or a particular period. It's just about this long-standing, close, mutually respectful relationship.
Yeah, the word respect is essential.
of course. The mutually respectful.
Yeah, and beyond expertises. I mean, you don't. To be honest, to put it simple, the reward you like to get or the respect that you would like to get is ultimately from the patients, not from your scientist colleagues. I mean, that's helpful in your career, but ultimately that's the big goal, that you do something for.
But as a scientist, that is unusual. It's probably more common from clinicians who see their patients on a daily basis.
Yeah, then maybe I'm an unusual type.
But I mean, but you created that. That's the point. It was your initiative to create this relationship, to want to learn from the patients, not to sit in your lab and do the science, but actually to engage.
Yeah.
That's an interesting. We'll talk about perhaps lessons for the future. David, any standout moments of our interactions over the years?
Yeah, I guess I'll just highlight dinners, and I mentioned that, Jeremy, because those dinners at these meetings, IGA meetings, were so warm, and I know I never felt I was, quote unquote, the industry representative and interloper there. I just felt like I was completely part of that community, and I looked forward to those dinners so much. Reconnecting with different people in the community at those moments, and all I can say is now I'm deep into my career, and I can look back. That was pretty unusual. The quality and the tone and the level of interaction and collaboration and warmth.
But because it was a relationship, I believe, of mutual respect, and that we could be in sessions, both scientific, but certainly when at these EGA meetings, when the companies would come in and then all the people would be sitting around the table and you'd be grilled like some kind of Senate Grand Committee, and pretty tough questioning, perhaps designed to make you a little bit uncomfortable and to put you on the spot. And yet after that, we would all go out for dinner and we'd sit and we'd be friends and have that friendly relationship, robust exchanges. But I do feel, and bringing it back from both of you, that the patient communities enjoyed the respect as well. We were treated as professionals and partners in this, and that was a very important factor, I think, in the development of the relationship. And it's good to hear that it helped ease things going forwards. Didn't always agree, but that's fine. But we disagreed agreeably, has been an expression.
We were working the same problem.
Yeah, we were working the same problem. We may have different solutions, but we were working the same problem. Challenges that remain. The IGA is 30 this year. We've got many years to go. I've just come from a board meetings where we've been talking about the challenges that still exist, the unmet medical need, the territories where there is still no access to treatment, the lack of information, neuropathic disease, comorbidities, all these things. But as a relationship, as a tripartite relationship with the clinical and scientific community, with industry, with the patient group, what's your take on the challenges that we together can work on?
Yes.
Hans,
it's a tough question, of course. You're asking basically to look 30 years ahead, There might be some things that one has to carefully consider. For example, there's also now this momentum of mutations in the GBA1 gene being a risk factor for Parkinson's disease. So there are now lots of scientists and companies attracted to this topic. So far we have had a clear focus. It's Gaucher disease. Yes, it could be neuronopathic and et cetera, but absorbing that GDPD community will be very difficult because it's a huge community. So one has to think very carefully about that, how to deal with that, because you also don't want to exclude information that comes from that field. There's a lot of basic research done on glucocerebrosidase in that field.
Yeah.
So that might be relevant also for Gaucher patients. So that will be one of the main challenges in the next couple of years to think about for the also for the working group as such.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, one of the concerns, of course, is that as there becomes a greater understanding of the connectivity with other conditions,
Yeah.
that the unique position of some Gaucher disease and a number of other lysosomal storage diseases gets lost because it becomes subsumed into something bigger. And I think there's a concern amongst the payers as well, or from our point of view, the payers, that they're going to lump the sort of rare disease, ultra-orphan disease together and revisit the funding the way that healthcare payers. David, your reflections on the past for a view of the future.
Yeah, I think I'm just starting where Hans was. You know, I mean, the science is better than ever. I think, you know, the probability we get a gene therapy for Gaucher is high. I think the probability that, you know, we can now, you know, we're getting better and better at approaching neurologic manifestations of different diseases. Those learnings are going to benefit Gaucher disease. So the science is incredibly powerful, and that has changed way for the better. I would argue in general, I think still probably for Gaucher, although diagnosis is better, I think that's still the biggest problem, you know, and challenge for a patient being born with Gaucher, and 30 years later, it's not the first thing a doctor thinks about, you know, when confronted with a classic case of Gaucher. You know, you have to be lucky to be seen by a doctor who's maybe seen a case before. So that hasn't changed. And then the last piece, you know, which you highlight, and I worry a lot about, you know, healthcare systems are under stress. And in the beginning, and I'll say Gaucher was right at the beginning, it wasn't a question of what the healthcare system could afford or not afford, to be honest with you. It was much more about, you know, how do we, you know, solve this problem and work together, meaning the different stakeholders. As I said, we all, you know, were sitting around the table. Now, absolutely, every disease, rare disease or not, is being challenged in a way that is for understandable reasons. But how healthcare systems evolve to be able to manage rare diseases while still preserving a business model, because I think what I hope, you know, patient communities, rare disease communities, Gaucher community, is you want a less expensive drug just because you do. It makes sense. And competition comes in, more patients, and all that will allow that to happen to a certain extent. You also want a business model. And so, you know, you want to make the system work for everybody. And so, you know, industry needs to realize that means everybody. It's not like you get to take a bigger share necessarily, but it needs to work. And so I worry about that. And I'm living it now in another disease, and I see how it's emerging, and we can all see, you know, the stress that these systems are under.
I mean, interesting.
Yeah, I just want to make a brief remark related to diagnosis. Of course, technically, I mean, it's very easy nowadays to diagnose Gaucher disease. I mean, especially with these lipid tests that you couldn't do in white blood spots. I mean, it's really, if they are positive in that, then you really have an actual deficiency in your enzyme because you measure a product of the activity. So so it's possible, but of course that doesn't mean that everybody is diagnosed timely, because the test needs to be requested. And that brings us also to the topic: should we screen everyone or not? And that's of course a different discussion.
I mean, you know, talking about within the patient community, what remains the great priority is access to treatment. Now, of course, access to treatment means different things in different countries, and diagnosis, of course, is one of them. And whilst diagnosis in Western Europe, in America, Eastern Europe remains easy, in other parts of the world where Gaucher patients have been discovered or come forward, access to diagnostics or proper diagnostics can remain a challenge even 30 years on. Comes back to the point that there are patients where we never expected there to be patients, but nonetheless there are patients, and the IGA have made it their responsibility that they support patients wherever they are in the globe. Any messages going forward, things that you'd like to say?
Just incredible congratulations. And I, you know, the IGA can look in the mirror and, you know, legitimately, proudly say, I mean, you've created a model. You know, I mentioned cystic fibrosis in the beginning. I think there's two diseases and disease organizations that have really led the way and continue to lead the way here. Slightly different reasons. One is CF and one is Gaucher. And so this story, very powerful and important to those who are within the community, very important to those outside the community who are looking in and trying to learn.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Hans?
Yes, again, I have to fully agree with David. I really hope that you will be able to continue for a very long time, because you play an essential role, as we have discussed during this chat clearly. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And thank you both very much for being with us. It has been a great pleasure to talk to you both, to be able to spend some time reminiscing and to look to the future. We together, industry, scientific legal community, the patient community, I think have a lot to feel proud of for the last 30 years activity. There have been many achievements. There's still a great deal to be done in different parts of the world, different challenges emerging, as Hans referred to. But I do believe that this collaborative approach, which again, tribute to Hans and the early leaders of the EWGGD, this collaborative approach puts us all in a much better place to continue to help the patient community, which I know is our prime move, our prime reason for doing what we do. So thank you both very much.